Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to do a final review of the Anbernic RG556. Now, I already did a first impressions video about this device when it first arrived about a week and a half ago. Since then, I've been playing it just about every day, doing all sorts of configurations, and just kind of using it in an everyday use case scenario. Now, because my first impressions video was super long, I think it was like 32 minutes altogether, it was kind of already a mini review. So in this one, I kind of want to wrap that all together, all the impressions that I got when I first picked it up, and then all the other things I've noticed about the RG556 since first making that other video. Now what I want to do is wrap this all together in what I'm calling the 10 major observations about the RG556, and I think that by going through each of these 10 elements, it'll really narrow it down whether or not this is going to be a good fit for you. So I do think it's going to be a little bit unconventional when it comes to my typical reviews, but I think it'll be entertaining nonetheless. Grab a snack and drink, and let's go ahead and dive right in. Okay, to start, I thought it was pretty hilarious that I could not choose a color between the two options that we have available. Now, I'm super lucky because I was able to test both of them for my review, and I just went back and forth between one and the other. Now, I don't think that either are perfect, but I'll tell you about some of the things I noticed along the way. Number one, I really do like the blue transparent model. It has a nice glassy texture to it in the sense that you can really see through it, so it's very transparent. In fact, it reminds me of a Nintendo Switch Joy-Con that I own. It's a little bit on the glassy side, and I really like that. And it's not something that you often will see in a dedicated retro handheld. However, there were two elements to it that were keeping me from saying it was the perfect fit for me. The first were the LED lights. When I first made my impressions video, I found them to be too bright, and I didn't see any sort of way to dim them down. Well, it turns out there is a way in the software to do that. What you have to do is long press on the top menu item, and this will bring up a quick menu where you can reduce the brightness. Now, for some reason, it's not showing the text on either of my models, but I am able to adjust it because there is a slider, so I can just move that down and it will dim it. The other toggles can do things like make it a breathing pattern, but I don't really like that. I like the solid color look. So it is nice that I'm able to fix it, and to be honest, I often just turn it off anyway. And part of that has to do with the fact that there are no RGB colors involved. It's just a white color altogether. It's nice. I like the fact that we have LEDs, but I would have loved to have had the ability to change the color on the fly as well. Either way, one of the things I didn't like about the transparent blue model has now been fixed because I'm able to dim the light if I would like, so that's awesome. The second thing I didn't like about the blue model in my first testing was that the color balance seemed to be off. And it's especially bad when you compare the two models side by side. It has a bit of a green hue to it. Now, thankfully, these devices are running Android 13, so you can actually go into the Android settings, then display and color and contrast. And within here, you have three different contrast options you can adjust. There's one called automatic, then increase contrast, and then standard. For both of my devices, they were set to the same thing, which was automatic contrast, but by changing them to standard, the color profile did change. However, even then, I wasn't super happy with the colors and how they were looking. However, if you keep it at the automatic contrast setting, you can actually adjust the color even more a little bit further down in the settings. So here you can actually manually adjust the warmth and the overall temperature to get it dialed in to exactly what you would like. Now, there are other factors affecting these colors, including what color background you are using for your desktop. So if you change that to something more neutral, that'll help as well. Either way, after messing around with the Android settings, I was able to dial in the colors exactly how I would like. So again, another thing I didn't like about the blue model has now been solved. Now, there is another color option. It's a black model, and initially that was the one I liked. There were a couple things going on with this one too. Number one, I prefer the LEDs on this one. There's a solid color shell, which is going to cover up a lot of the LED light bleed, and so as a result, the LEDs just look a lot more balanced. Again, it would be awesome if they were colored, but all the same, I do like the look of them here. However, the thing I don't really like about the black model is that the plastic that they're using is really slick and very smudgy, and so even after a few minutes of use, it'll pick up on fingerprints, so I spent a lot of time wiping this one down. Now, the transparent model also gets fingerprinty, but it is nowhere near the same as it is with the black model. So in the end, I chose the transparent model as my forever model, and that's because I like the fact that it doesn't get quite as smudgy. I think it has a nice overall look with that really transparent look, and now that I can dim the LEDs and also rebalance the colors, I really don't see any other reason to get the other model. Now, of course, this is a personal preference, but I did just want to note that there is no perfect one between the two, and I ended up picking the blue one overall. Now, the next observation I had about this device is that the screen on this is awesome. Now, in my first impressions video, I kind of felt the same way, but I think I feel it even more strongly now. Number one, this is a 1080p resolution display, 5.5 inches, and AMOLED, which is amazing. Not only that, it's a good OLED panel. They had an older OLED version before, which was a PS Vita screen. That one was okay, but it was a lower resolution and just didn't have very good touch control either. And I do think that this one is a major improvement over that old PS Vita screen in a big way. Not only is it larger, it's 5.5 inches, which I think is a perfect screen size for a handheld device, but it's also got a huge brightness range. It can go from very, very dim to super bright as well. In fact, most of the time I only play it at about half brightness, which means I'm going to save on battery life too. And the touch response on this is very good too. It's about 125 Hz, which makes it over twice as much as the actual refresh rate on the screen, which is always kind of the target that you want when it comes to touch response. And of course, to top it off, because it's OLED, it has these beautiful bright and saturated colors and also a very rich contrast. And so it's a beautiful screen to look at, and one of the best I've found at around this price point. Next up, I want to talk about controls, because these have actually improved a little bit in my mind over the past week and a half of testing. Overall, I would say that these controls are mostly great. A couple of these things are very opinionated. For example, the analog stick placement here, they have the analog stick up top, the D-pad down at the bottom. A lot of people like that with more modern games, but if you're playing retro games, you may prefer something with the D-pad on top. Personally, based on the type of games that I've been playing, which have mostly been like PS2 and GameCube games, all of those are very analog stick friendly, and so this has been a good match for me. I also think it has solid face buttons and a good D-pad, so no issues there when it comes to just using the controls. It took a little bit to get used to the glossy D-pad itself, but after I kind of got that all figured out, yeah, it's been just fine. But there are a couple elements that keep them only mostly great instead of really great. The first are the triggers. These are a little bit stiff. They take a little bit more force than I was expecting. I love the fact that they are analog triggers and they work super well, but when it comes to fast reaction trigger gameplay, something like a first-person shooter game, it is a little bit more resistance than I would like. The other thing I would say is a negative about these controls, and this one's a much bigger negative, is the fact that these analog sticks feel really small and outdated. These are the same Hall sensor sticks that they've been using for a few devices now, which means they're going to be less prone to stick drift. However, I have found that the overall use of them is not that great. In fact, when you use a gamepad tester and you try to just move them around, you'll find that they really snap to either the very outer edge, which means they're going to be a 100% push rate, or they're going to snap to a cardinal direction, like north, south, east, and west. So overall, they don't feel very analog in their movement. They really will just snap over to one side, and it'll usually be up, down, left, or right. Not only that, these sticks themselves feel very small. They're very flicky feeling, and that's a lot like how it is with a Nintendo Switch Joy-Con. And these are a very similar experience to that, and we've seen better in other handhelds over the past few months. In particular, the analog sticks that we've seen on the recent Retroid Pocket and Odin releases are the same sticks, and they're a little bit smaller, but have a full range of motion. In fact, as soon as you use the sticks on a Retroid Pocket or Odin device, you can tell the difference right then and there. It almost feels like they're just smaller console sticks, and so because of that, they are really nice. I tried a bunch of different things to make it a better experience in the RG556, including using thumbstick caps so I could put those on top just to give it a little bit more height and then at least a little bit more motion. But unfortunately, even when you add height to it, it doesn't actually give you a full range. It just makes it kind of flop over a little bit more. And so it's still a flicky experience, just taller, and so it wasn't that much of an improvement for me. Another thing I tried was a certain pack of analog stick caps. I'll leave them linked down below, but essentially these had a little foam insert that you could put underneath the stick. The idea here is that they would give you a little bit smoother of a feel as you move them around. And I could definitely tell the resistance there, but I didn't feel like it was making it any smoother. If anything, it just made it harder to press the analog sticks. So I didn't keep these on either. In the end, I ended up taking off the thumbstick cap as well as those foam inserts and just used these sticks as they are and just kind of got used to them. Unfortunately, I think these sticks are the one thing that is holding this entire device back when it comes to controls. Now for me, it's not a deal breaker. If anything, it just feels a little bit outdated, and I think that Anbernic should be upgrading these in the future, and if they don't, I think it's just going to get worse and worse. And I do want to emphasize here that the controls are mostly great. It just happens to be that the analog sticks really hold them back, and so I do hope these are upgraded sometime in the future. Okay, for my next observation, this was something that I also noticed right there in the beginning, but it's something I feel more strongly about now, and that's the fact that this device is super comfortable. And I think we should give props to Anbernic for the upgrades they've done here, because this is a lot better comfort-wise than most other devices they've ever released. And I'm not sure what's going on here. Maybe they hired a new ergonomics engineer or something, but this is a big step forward compared to some previous devices. To start, we should talk about the V-shaped control scheme that they're using here. This is pretty rare in a retro handheld. What this means is they took the D-pad and the right analog stick and they've pushed them inboard, closer to the screen than the other controls. On the D-pad side, that means that because it's a little bit further away from the palm of your hands, that means means your thumb can stretch a little bit more, making it more comfortable and not as cramped. And so even though this is not a D-pad centric device, getting to the D-pad is still very comfortable. The other benefit is when you put the right analog stick a little bit more inboard, that means it's easier to reach the face buttons without bumping into that analog stick. So I think overall it's great that they used a V-shaped design. And I think it becomes a really stark contrast when you compare it against other devices they've released before, especially the Win600. The thing about this one is that the controls on it were just terrible. You can see that the analog sticks are on the bottom, and not only that, they are actually shifted outboard a little bit. And it makes it almost impossible to really play dual analog stick games with the shoulders and triggers at the same time. In fact, if you think about it, it's a Windows PC, which many PC games use that kind of setup, and so it really held the device back. And so this was a very uncomfortable device to try to use in anything but D-pad centric gameplay. And so I love the fact that they've come such a long way over the past 18 months. In fact, I would say it's the second most comfortable Android-based handheld I've ever used. I still think that the Logitech G Cloud is a little bit better. This one's a little bit roomier feeling, I think partly because it has a 7-inch screen, and so there's a little bit more space to work with. But all the same, I would say this one's a little bit more comfortable than the RG556. But in the end, getting a silver medal when it comes to ergonomics among all of the other various Android handhelds that are out there is pretty awesome. So I think from a hardware perspective, this is a home run in most respects. There's a couple things holding me back from saying it's perfect, but overall I think it is very good. However, once you turn the device on, then you start to deal with Anbernic's janky software, and that's going to be our next topic. Now, this is an Android-based device, and some people really hate that, some people love it, but there are some perks that come along with it. For example, sleep and powering off is super easy, it just kind of comes part and parcel with Android. But you do have to bear in mind that Anbernic themselves made this Android image, and they made a couple tweaks here, and there are some things that are a little bit weird. And I'll give you a few examples. First, there's a performance mode. They call it high mode. You can swipe down from the top and actually toggle that on, but I found from a performance standpoint, it doesn't seem to do anything at all. Running the same benchmarks with it having it off and on basically give you the exact same results. So it does feel more like a placebo than anything. There's also two different control schemes that they have baked into the software. There's what they call Nintendo Switch mode and then Xbox mode. And switching between the two does make something happen. For example, when you have a Nintendo Switch mode, the A, B, and XY is going to match the pattern on the buttons themselves. But if you switch it over to Xbox mode, it's going to fit the Xbox pattern where A is on the bottom. On top of that, if you want to use the full analog trigger functionality, you have to turn it on to Xbox mode. Nintendo Switch mode will give you a digital trigger. And so for me personally, I just usually leave it on Xbox mode because I can have those full analog triggers, and then also I prefer to have the A button on the bottom. But the weird thing is if you leave it on Xbox mode and then you restart the device, it'll still say Xbox mode when you turn it back on, but it'll actually be in Switch mode. So what you have to do is swipe down from the top, then switch it over to the Nintendo Switch mode and then back into Xbox mode. Then it's actually going to work. It's one of those things that's just slightly annoying, but it's been that way for many of their other devices and they haven't fixed it, and it's been about a year and a half at this point. And there are some things that Anbernic does to try to improve the experience for everybody. For example, they have built their own Android front end. They actually have a dedicated button for it, so if you press that, it'll bring up the front end mode. And if you buy one of their preloaded cards that have a bunch of games on it already, it's actually going to work fairly seamlessly, so you can have all your Nintendo games accessed right then and there. However, this is not a perfect solution. I know for a lot of people they want something that's plug and play, but it is not as great as you might think. I'm not going to go into all the details here because I did that in my previous RG405V video, and I'll leave that link down below. And so if you really want to see whether or not that's going to be a good fit for you, I would recommend checking out that video. But I would say that the way that their front end works is kind of like a house of cards. Everything's been stacked up perfectly, but if you make any sort of change to it, it's all going to fall apart. For example, they've preloaded a bunch of emulators on here. Most of these are actually paid emulators that they've pirated and then put on the device for you. And the reason why they've preloaded these emulators on here is because they've configured them for their front end. So in a perfect world, you'll be able to put in your preloaded SD card, open up that front end, and then access all of your games. But the thing to bear in mind is that you can't update any of that software because it's meant to use only that specific emulator. And so yes, it does give you a plug and play experience, but you are going to leave a lot of performance on the table because a lot of these emulators are super old. For example, if we look at their GameCube emulator versus the one you can download directly on the Dolphin website, it's about 500 releases behind. And as you can imagine, there have been a bunch of optimizations and improvements over those 500 releases. So in a way, yes, you are able to jump in and play certain games games pretty easily if you buy a preloaded card, but I wouldn't recommend it. I think you should set everything up yourself. And I imagine that'll be a daunting prospect if this is your very first handheld, but you do have a couple tools to help you out on that way. Number one, I've made a couple different Android-based guides, including one for the RP4 Pro, which is very, very similar to this device. And so you can really just watch that video and get 99% of what you need to set up the RG556. In addition, I am working on a written guide that'll kind of show you how to remove all the software jank from the Anbernic devices, and then it'll walk you through the process of using that Retroid guide as well. Anyway, I'm still working on that one. I wanted to finish this video first, so you'll see that pop up in the next day or two. And I will leave it linked down below once it's ready. Now, there's also another silver lining to this, and that is a software called Gamma OS. This is a custom Android build made for Anbernic devices, is being worked on for this device in particular. And this is probably going to fix a lot of the jank that comes with Anbernic software, and it often does things like improve performance and battery life as well. So in a nutshell, even though Anbernic software does leave a lot to be desired, there are opportunities to make it a lot better. And one way to really improve that experience is to use a good front end. So let's talk about that next. Now, just the other day, I made a video about Emulation Station Desktop Edition, which has now been released for Android. And I'm really excited about this release. After all, I just made a 30-minute video showing everyone how to set that up. It does take quite a bit of work to get it going, especially more than other options like Daijisho, but I think that investment is well worth it because once you have it all set up, it feels very console-like. Not only that, there are quite a few features that are really neat. For example, the ability to curate and make your own custom collections. Just over the past couple days, I've made quite a few, like a collection of Mario games or driving games or vertical shooters. And all these I curated myself by putting just my very favorites in there. And there are also some really subtle features within Emulation Station that once you get used to them, they are really great. For example, you can scrape the media and box art and videos, all that kind of stuff directly for each game using 2 different databases. And you can also scrape the manuals for most of these games. So there's a whole community of people out there who are scanning these old manuals, then uploading them. And then once you've scraped everything, you can press the Y menu. It'll bring up the video of the game, and then you press up on the D-pad, it'll give you that manual. And here you can look through these manuals. It's kind of like flipping through them back in the day. And so I think that's really awesome. There's also a variety of different themes that you can use with Emulation Station, including some that really change the look and feel of the device. In fact, one that I was messing around with yesterday is called Razor. This one's got a totally different look to it. Usually they're vertical or horizontal. This one has a grid style view, so you can go through here, click on each of these collections, and then navigate through your games this way. And so I love the fact that we have all these different themes that really improve the experience of using the Anbernic RG556. Now don't get me wrong, it does take some work to get this all set up, especially if it's your very first time, but I think it's well worth it because once you're done, it turns an Android-based device, which usually just kind of feels like a phone with some stuff slapped on it, to an actual gaming console, and that doesn't really happen with Android. Anyway, if you are interested in checking this out, I'll leave a link to my Emulation Station video down below as well. Okay, switching gears from the user experience, let's talk about price versus performance, because I think it is actually very good on the Anbernic RG556. Number one, I think the price is reasonable. It's $185 plus shipping, and right now I think it's still at a pre-order price around $175. Either way, I would consider this to be under $200 depending on where you live after shipping and all that. And I think for that amount of money, you're going to get some great performance. Now, when it comes to retro game systems, they're all going to play fine. Everything up through like PlayStation Portable, all these can be upscaled to a 1080p resolution, no problem. So if you want to play those old classic systems, Nintendo, Super Nintendo, obviously these are going to play great, but even your upscaled ones like PlayStation 1, Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, Saturn, and PlayStation Portable, Nintendo DS, I could go on and on. All those systems are going to play great. Not only that, the power here is good enough to get to that next threshold. That means systems like Nintendo 3DS, PlayStation 2, and GameCube are all playable on here. Now, there will be some limitations. For example, there may be some drivers issues with the Mali GPU in this device, and then also compatibility with the emulator itself doesn't mean that every single game is going to play perfectly. But I would say that the vast majority of PlayStation 2 and GameCube games are playable. As an example, when it came to GameCube, by default, I set everything to a 2x or about a 720p resolution. So that does mean your graphics are going to look sharper than the original console experience. And I would say that for the vast majority of games, 2x resolution for GameCube worked really well. And that does include some heavy-hitting games, including Metroid Prime 2, Burnout 2, SSX 3, and Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. So I think across the board that I'm comfortable saying that yeah, most GameCube games are going to play fine here, but I would recommend some tweaks here and there. For example, with F-Zero GX, I had to run this one at a 1x resolution, and I also used a PAL ROM. That means the game is going to play at a 50 Hz refresh rate, but playing at 50 frames per second is a lot easier to reach than 60, and so as a result, I would say this game is playable too. There were a couple games that still didn't play at full speed. For example, I tried Rogue Squadron 3. This one actually just crashed after that really awkward dance scene in the beginning. So not every GameCube game is going to play, and you may have to go into the settings and really configure things for certain games, but overall, I think it's going to be a really good match. Now, Nintendo Wii was not quite as good. Most of these games I actually dropped down to a 1x resolution just to make sure I was getting really good performance. And even then, there were a couple games that still struggled to get a full frame rate, like Mario Kart Wii and Mario Galaxy. So for a couple games, I would recommend using the PAL ROM, so it only goes up to 50 frames per second. But even then, I think it's still going to be a pretty good experience for most Wii games. Now, PlayStation 2 was similar, but a little bit more of a mixed bag. There were definitely games that could play at a 2x resolution, including some that I really wasn't expecting, like Midnight Club 3. I also had a couple of requests for other games like NBA Street 2, this one played at a 2x resolution just fine, as well as Onimusha Dawn of Dreams. So they are definitely games that'll play well on the PlayStation 2 emulator at a 2x resolution. However, I did find that the vast majority of them played better at a 1.5x resolution. So that's one of the nice things about the PlayStation 2 emulator is that you can go in 0.25 increments. And I think that a 1.5 resolution worked really well for this particular chipset. This made games like Ratchet & Clank Going Commando and Sly Cooper 1 play at a full speed, which is great. Dragon Quest VIII also played really well, although I did have to do some setting tweaks. I'll leave them on the screen right here. And I played a lot of PS2 and GameCube games in my impressions video, so I don't want to do too much overlap, but I did want to just note that there are going to be some games you have to play at a 1x resolution. And I would say that Dynasty Warriors 5 is one of those examples that yes, it's totally playable, but it's going to be a little bit chunkier when it comes to the graphics just because it is at that native resolution. So I am treating this a little bit like the GameCube in that yes, most of these games are going to be playable, but you do have to do some tweaks here and there, and I think overall a 1.5x resolution is probably going to be your better standard. Now, one system that isn't quite that great is going to be Nintendo Switch emulation. For the most part, only really lightweight indie titles are going to play at full speed. Again, I did a full demonstration of that in my impressions video. Suffice to say, when it comes to those lightweight or really small file size games, those will play just fine. But once you get into like 3D graphic games, like Super Mario 3D World, yeah, it's going to have a hard time running these at full speed. Now, there are some tricks you can do. For example, you can reduce the resolution lower to 1x, so you can do like 0.75 or 0.5, but I've always found that those games look pretty gnarly at that point, and so I don't really enjoy doing it that way. Either way, for under $200, I think it's great to have a device that can play most PlayStation 2 and GameCube games pretty easily. And besides just the raw performance, I did want to jump into my next observation, and that is that this device can do just about anything when you think about it. Because it's an Android-based device, some of these things are really seamless. For example, it has USB-C video out up to 1080p. So all you have to do is get an HDMI to USB-C adapter, you can plug this into your monitor or TV and start playing just like that. And because the native resolution and aspect ratio of this device is 1080p 16:9, it's going to translate perfectly into that video output. So all the scaling that you set up for the device itself is going to work perfectly on the output as well. Now, unfortunately, there is no way to turn off the screen when you have it set up like this, but you can just dim it down a bunch and it's going to save you on battery life there. And in addition, because this device has Bluetooth 5.2, that means that you can set it up with a Bluetooth controller and kind of consoleize your whole experience. So I do like the fact that this device is kind of a 2-in-1 in the fact that you can play it in handheld mode, but then you can also hook it up to a monitor or a screen and then play it in docked mode too. And because it's an Android-based device, that means streaming is going to be super simple. So streaming from your Xbox or PlayStation or from your PC, all those things have apps for them in the Play Store, and it's all going to work out well. I've also found that I can charge this device with basically any plug or cable that I've found, and so that's going to be really nice depending on what you have. Not only that, we've got a nice big battery. It's 5,500 milliamp hours, and I found that in a worst case scenario, when I push the device as hard as I can get, I get about 3.5 hours of battery life. And remember, that's a worst case scenario. I found that if you're just playing something lightweight, like PlayStation 1 or Super Nintendo, I can get something like 15 hours of battery life. So it's really great. And so that's one of my favorite things about this device over the past week and a half is that I've been playing it a ton and I really just charge it up when I feel like it. I don't have to sit there and actually watch the battery drain like some other devices. And speaking of which, I think this leads into my next observation, which is a comparison against the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. because at the end of the day, I have been using this more than the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, and I probably will continue to do that in the future. Now, this is super subjective, so I don't want to see anybody coming at me with pitchforks, but I did want to show you my comparison chart right here. Now, to be honest, it's kind of hard to compare the RG556 and the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro because they're both excellent devices and they are very similar in many ways. So for example, when looking at my chart and comparing them side by side, you can see that most of the text is actually going to be in a white font. And that's because between the two, I found them to be mostly equitable or very subjective. And so for example, they are at a very similar price point, $185 versus $199, and so I thought that was mostly equitable. But in the next row, you can see that performance-wise, the RP4 Pro is more performant. This one can play most PS2 and GameCube games at a 2x resolution as opposed to 1.5x like we saw with PS2 on the RG556. Not only that, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro doesn't require as much finagling to get everything to work. And when it comes to performance benchmarks, you can see that the Retroid Pocket 4 and the RG556 are about neck and neck, and so there's not a big difference between the two. But when you go to the $200 Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, you can see that the performance jumps quite a bit. So if you're looking for the best performance at around that $200 price point, then I do think the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro definitely wins in that regard. However, that's just one of many factors, so let's go back to the chart and go through the rest. For example, I love the fact that the RG556 has a larger screen and that it's AMOLED and 1080p. That means it's going to be a perfect fit for like game streaming, which is usually going to be at a 1080p resolution. But even then, just having a larger screen means that the text is going to be easier to read when playing more modern games. And of course, we have all the benefits of OLED, including that really rich contrast and everything else. Now, they are of a different size. I would consider the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro to be pocketable, but I would not consider the same with the RG556. Instead, I would consider this to be a portable device. This is something you would probably want to put in a case and then use that instead. In fact, I still think that the RG556 case that they sell from Anbernic is just still hilarious, and so I've been using this every day. It's a great conversation starter. And so yes, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is a lot smaller and more pocketable if that's important to you, but that's not to say that the RG556 is like huge and heavy. In fact, it's still a relatively small handheld about the size of a Nintendo Switch Lite. And there are some benefits of having a larger size, like ergonomics, which I think are better on the RG556. The Retroid Pocket 4 Pro has a more flat or Nintendo Switch Lite style kind of interface. And so if I had to choose between the two when it comes to playing especially more modern games, I would definitely prefer the RG556. Now, if you want to play something that's more D-pad centric, then I think the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is a little bit more comfortable just because it's naturally built that way. And I do think that the analog sticks on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro are miles better than the RG556. So depending on your play style, one might be a better match for you than the other. The software is about neck and neck as well. They both have their own quirks and jankiness to them, although I do think that the Retroid one is a little bit better and has more frequent updates. That being said, once I figured out all the quirks of the RG556 software, I did find it to be workable. And then finally, when it comes to game streaming, I did prefer the RG556. I found it to be more comfortable and that 1080p display scales a lot better. However, bear in mind that it's only Wi-Fi 5 versus Wi-Fi 6, and so if you do have a Wi-Fi 6 setup in your home network, it would be better to use the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro if speed is your determining factor. For me personally, the Wi-Fi in my home is 5 GHz, so I'm not really seeing any added benefit there, and so overall, I do prefer the streaming here on the RG556. So in a nutshell, I think that they are very close between the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro and the RG556, but personally, I do prefer the RG556 mostly because it's more comfortable and it has that bigger and nicer screen. And of course, it's a very subjective decision, but the fact that we are even comparing these two neck and neck like this says a lot about the RG556 because the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is an amazing handheld too. Personally, I think between the old generation, when it was the RG505 or 405M versus the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, I always thought the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus was the clear winner. This time around, it's a lot closer, but I do think the RG556 is a little bit better for me. And I think that leads into my final observation, and that I think that the RG556 is almost perfect, at least when it comes to an Anbernic handheld. Overall, I think there are just really two things that are negatives about it at the end of the day. Number one is the plastic material on that black model. I think that it's smudgy and slick, and it just doesn't feel very good. The second is that the analog sticks are not great. They are passable, you can definitely get them to work, but I've seen much better in other handhelds recently. And I don't think the software is perfect, it requires some tweaking, but I think that's part of the fun in getting these handhelds in the first place, is just kind of curating that experience specifically for you. So the Anbernic device is going to require that, but after I went through and did all that stuff, I liked it a lot more. And like I mentioned, check the link down below because I'll have a written guide which will walk you through how to remove some of those software issues. At the end of the day, once you have this device set up, I think it's one of the best handhelds that you can get at this price point. I think that it goes neck and neck with the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, which again is a really great handheld. And so if you are looking at around that $200 price point, you can't go wrong with either. Between the two, I think I am preferring the RG556 more, but it is something I probably want to follow up on about 6 months from now. And I would also be remiss if I didn't mention the Odin 2. This is a device that's a lot more expensive. It starts at $300, but can get even higher from there. But the performance on this one is even better. It can play all those PlayStation 2 and GameCube games, but at a 3x or higher resolution, and it can play a good amount of Nintendo Switch games. In fact, most games that I play on this device work better. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that this one's using a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 processor, which is very compatible with the Yuzu emulator. So in the end, either the RG556 or the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro are not the best handhelds out there, but the best out there at that $200 price point. And so if that's your personal budget and you're looking for great performance and you're wondering about the Anbernic RG556, then yes, I give it a hearty recommendation. It definitely has a couple issues, just like with any other handheld out on the market, but I think there are way more positives than negatives. And so yeah, I think the RG556 is an excellent handheld device. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you picking this one up, or are you going to go with the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, or are you going to splurge and get the Odin 2 instead? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.